This is the story of a revolution that almost nobody noticed. For most of the 20th century, archaeology was slow. It moved at the pace of trowels and brushes. A career-defining excavation might run for 30 years. A site might give up its secrets over the course of 3 generations of digging. The discipline produced a confident, gradually built picture of who we are and where we came from. And the textbooks settled. Then, somewhere around the year 2015, the pace changed. Not all at once, not with a single headline. 3 different technologies, developed independently for different reasons, in different fields, began to converge on the same target, and the target was the human past. The first was a kind of light, fired down from airplanes and able to see through trees. It's called Lidar. The second was a way of reading the genetic code locked inside ancient bones, the field known as Paleogenomics. The third was a kind of sonar that could map what lies on the floor of the sea. Each of these, on its own, would have been a significant tool. Together, in less than a decade, they have done something the trowels and brushes could never do. They've shown us how much of the human story was simply invisible to the methods we had. They've found cities where the textbooks said there were only forests. They've read messages from people who left no other trace, written into the genes of their descendants. They've begun to map the coastlines that the rising oceans of the last ice age swallowed whole. And the story they're telling, taken together, isn't the one we grew up with. What you're about to see isn't a fringe theory. It's not Atlantis. It's not lost civilizations from another dimension. It's what mainstream, peer-reviewed, well-funded science has been quietly publishing while most of us were looking the other way. And it's changing everything. We start with the light. LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging. The technology itself is straightforward. An aircraft flies over a stretch of land, firing hundreds of thousands of laser pulses per second at the ground below. Most of those pulses hit leaves and branches and bounce back. A small fraction of them slip through the gaps in the canopy, reach the actual surface of the ground, and bounce back from there. A computer then strips away every pulse that hit a tree, and what remains is something no human eye has ever seen from above. The bare earth. Every contour, every rise, every shape of everything that was ever built on it. For most of human history, the jungle has been archaeology's enemy. The places where the climate is warm and wet enough to grow dense forest are also the places where wood and cloth and bone rot most aggressively. They're also the places where, until very recently, an archaeologist on the ground couldn't see more than a few meters in any direction. Whole civilizations could have lived and died in those forests, and we would have walked right past their cities. That, it turns out, is exactly what happened. In 2018, a research consortium called PACUNAM published the results of a LiDAR survey covering more than 2,000 square kilometers of the Guatemalan rainforest. They were looking for traces of the classic Maya. What they found was 60,000 previously unknown structures: pyramids, causeways, defensive walls, agricultural terraces, whole networks of cities and roads connecting them, hidden under the trees for more than 1,000 years. The famous site of Tikal was revealed to be 4 times larger than previously thought. The estimated population of the lowland Maya, based on this single survey, had to be revised upward by a factor of at least 2, possibly 4. We weren't slightly wrong about how many people had lived there. We were catastrophically wrong. The same technology then turned to the Amazon. In 2024, a study published in Science revealed that the Upano Valley, in the eastern foothills of the Ecuadorian Andes, contained the remains of an urban civilization built between 2,500 and 3,000 years ago. The LiDAR maps showed clusters of monumental platforms, plazas, and dead-straight roads cutting through the landscape. The mounds were up to 150 meters long. The scale of the landscape modification was comparable to the classic Maya. The Amazon, the supposed virgin wilderness, had been a network of garden cities. Other surveys, in Bolivia and across the wider Amazon basin, have now suggested that somewhere between 10,000 and 24,000 pre-Columbian earthworks may exist throughout the region. Pyramids reaching 21 meters high, causeways, reservoirs, defensive embankments, an entire continent's worth of urban infrastructure, hidden under canopy, missed by every archaeologist who ever walked through it. The Amazon, it turns out, wasn't empty. It had been a domesticated forest, sculpted by human hands for thousands of years. And LiDAR is just the first of the 3. The second revolution began in a freezer. In the early 2000s, a small group of geneticists led by Svante Pääbo working in Leipzig began trying to do something that had been considered impossible. They were trying to extract intact, readable DNA from human bones tens of thousands of years old. The bones were ancient, the DNA inside them was degraded into millions of tiny fragments, and most of what they were sequencing was bacterial contamination. For years, the work produced almost nothing. And then, in 2010, they published a complete genome. It belonged to a Neanderthal. What that genome revealed cracked the textbook open. Modern humans, the descendants of the ones who walked out of Africa, hadn't simply replaced the Neanderthals when they encountered them in Eurasia. They'd interbred with them. Between 1 and 4% of the DNA of every non-African human alive today comes from a Neanderthal ancestor. The species we'd been told was a dead-end branch of the family tree had, in fact, survived. Just not as itself, as pieces of us. Later that same year, the same lab announced something even stranger. A single finger bone found in a cave in southern Siberia called Denisova contained DNA that didn't match Neanderthals and didn't match modern humans. It was a third kind of person. An entire previously unknown human species, identified not from a skull or a skeleton, but from a fragment of a pinky. The Denisovans, it turns out, also interbred with our ancestors. Up to 5% of the DNA of people in parts of Melanesia and the Philippines today comes from them. We share the planet, genetically, with at least 2 extinct human lineages that the fossil record alone could never have told us about. The same techniques have been turned, in the years since, on the deep history of every populated continent. The results have rewritten the migration map again and again. The original peopling of the Americas, once thought to be a single wave across Beringia, the Bering Land Bridge, now appears to involve at least 2 or 3 separate movements of genetically distinct populations, some of which left no recognizable trace in the fossil record at all. The mysterious arrival of the so-called Yamnaya, a population of horse-riding pastoralists from the steppes north of the Black Sea, has been shown by geneticists like David Reich to have swept across Europe roughly 5,000 years ago, replacing or absorbing the existing populations, and carrying with them the Indo-European languages that almost half the world still speaks. A third of the modern European gene pool, it turns out, arrived in a single migration, and nobody before the DNA had known. What ancient DNA has done is something archaeology by itself could never do. It's given a voice to people who left no monuments, no writing, no settlements that survived. They left only their descendants. And the descendants, it turns out, were carrying the message all along, and we've only just begun to read it. The third revolution is happening underwater. To understand why this matters, you have to start with a number. At the height of the last ice age, roughly 20,000 years ago, so much of the world's water was locked up in continental ice sheets that the sea was about 120 meters lower than it is today. 120 meters. That's the height of a 40-story building. It's the distance from the surface of the Atlantic down to a depth most divers will never see. What that means in practical terms is that the coastlines our ancestors lived on for tens of thousands of years aren't where the coastlines are now. They're out there, somewhere, on what we now call the continental shelf. Drowned. And it's on those drowned coastlines that humans, who have always preferred to live near water, would most likely have built their earliest settlements. For most of archaeological history, that landscape was unreachable. You can't dig at 100 meters of depth. You can't survey it on foot. Until very recently, you couldn't even see it. The floor of the sea was a blank blue space on the map. Then the sonars improved. High-resolution multi-beam sonar, the kind originally developed for oil exploration and military mapping, can now produce 3-dimensional maps of the seafloor accurate to within a few centimeters. Combined with sub-bottom profilers, which use lower-frequency sound to look beneath the sediment itself, marine archaeologists can now scan large stretches of the continental shelf for the unmistakable signatures of human construction. Straight lines, right angles, stone foundations buried under thousands of years of silt. And they're starting to find them. In the North Sea, between Britain and Denmark, lies a region geologists call Doggerland. 8,000 years ago, it was a vast plain of rivers and marshes and human communities, larger than modern-day Germany. The Storegga tsunami, around 8,200 years ago, was one of the catastrophic events that helped accelerate its final submergence. Sonar surveys have now mapped the lost river valleys in extraordinary detail. Bottom trawlers have been pulling up Mesolithic harpoons and human bones for decades, but only now are we able to reconstruct, in 3 dimensions, the world they came from. Doggerland wasn't a footnote to European prehistory, it was a major piece of it, and it's entirely underwater. In the Mediterranean, similar techniques have revealed the sunken Bronze Age port of Pavlopetri off the coast of Greece, and more controversially, possible structures in the Gulf of Kambat off the coast of India that some Indian researchers have argued may date to the end of the last ice age. The dating of the Indian sites remains disputed. The evidence is preliminary, and the mainstream archaeological community urges caution. But the surveys are continuing. What seabed mapping has done is open a door that was closed for the entirety of modern archaeology. The space behind that door is enormous. More than 20 million square kilometers of land was drowned at the end of the last ice age. We've surveyed so far a fraction of 1% of it. If the human story of the Ice Age was written anywhere, it was written along those coastlines, and we've only just begun to look. 3 technologies. One developed for forestry, one for genetics, one for oil exploration. None of them designed originally to do archaeology. Taken one at a time, each of these has produced impressive discoveries. The kind of discoveries that get one news cycle, a documentary segment, a magazine cover. But the real story, the one we're still in the middle of, is what happens when you put their results next to each other on the same desk. Lidar has shown us that the places we thought were empty wilderness, the Amazon, the lowland Maya forests, the highlands of southern Mexico, were in fact full of cities. The population of pre-Columbian America wasn't the few million the textbooks once estimated. It was, by current best estimates, somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. Whole civilizations, comparable in scale to the great empires of Eurasia, simply didn't enter the historical record because they built primarily in earth and wood, and because the forest reclaimed them before anyone from outside ever saw them. Ancient DNA has shown us that the human family tree was never the simple ladder of the diagrams. It was a braided river. Modern humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and at least 1 or 2 other lineages we haven't yet given names to all overlapped, met, and mixed for tens of thousands of years. The peopling of the Americas happened in multiple waves, not one. The peopling of Europe happened in 3. Almost every settled story about who lived where and when has had to be redrawn. And seabed mapping is just starting to show us that the coastlines our ancestors most likely built on during the long, low sea level millennia of the last ice age aren't lost. They're simply underwater. 20 million square kilometers of them. Put these 3 discoveries side by side and a single thought begins to take shape. The human story is older than we thought, it's larger than we thought, it's more complex than we thought, and much of it was, until about a decade ago, simply invisible to the tools we were using to look. This isn't a claim that everything the textbooks said was wrong. The textbooks were, in many ways, exactly as right as the evidence available at the time allowed them to be. What the new technologies are showing us isn't that the old picture was a lie. It's that the old picture was a sketch, a first draft, a best guess made under the constraint of what trowels and brushes could find. The second draft is being written now. It's being written in laser scans of the Ecuadorian Amazon, in genetic sequences pulled from a 40,000-year-old finger bone, and in sonar maps of seabeds where, until recently, there was nothing but blue. We're not at the end of this revolution. We're barely at the beginning of it. But this much already is clear. The human past isn't what we were taught it was. And the deepest changes to our understanding of who we are, where we came from, and how long the story has been going on aren't coming from the fringe. They're coming from the data.